Welcome back to my garden and part 2 in my series of films about the summer holidays, the visits we received. Last week I was telling you about Elizabeth, the juggler, and she left us after a wonderful visit and didn't feel like it was the best part of a decade since we'd last seen her. But isn't that just the way with friends, the years just roll away. But leave she did, life goes on, hers and ours, and she went back to Sibiuma in Rio Grande do Norte, nearby, and that was round about the time of the World Cup final, and that little episode ended as well, a non-seasonal feast of football, and we had about a day's rest before the big family visit rolled in. Now, normally it rolls in via a taxi from the airport, but this time, well, it was quite an adventure. One of Rita's nieces, one of her nieces, Thais, is married to a chap, Roberto, who has a business doing school transport, in minibuses, which he owns. And for a long time they've been talking about this, and then they had a little daughter who's quite an amazing character, but she was very small, too small for travelling, because the travelling they had in mind was a bus trip, a road trip. A bus trip. They weren't coming by any old bus. They were coming on their school bus. Thais, Roberto, their daughter Aninha, her mum, her aunt, and her cousin. All sorts of, I think there were one or two others rolled in the journey, either going or coming. At any rate, it was a road trip. Now, you may or may not be familiar with Brazilian geography, but here in these parts of the world, Latin America, people talk about how Brazil isn't a country, it's a continent. Well, it's half a continent, to be honest. I mean, literally half of South America is Brazil. It's bigger, mainland Brazil. Brazil is bigger than mainland United States of America. If you mainland, that would just eliminate Hawaii. But if you think of the connected America, avoid Alaska, well, Brazil is bigger than that sort of standard USA, sort of blob north of Canada. So in short, Brazil is pretty darn big. And the journey from Sao Paulo in the southeast to where we live in Ceará in the northeast is well over 3,000 kilometers. So I suppose what's that? It's probably around about 2,000 miles. A big journey in whatever measuring system, metric or imperial, is your favoured option. It's a jolly long way. And it took them a few days. They drove up through the centre of the country, mostly sleeping in the bus. That must have been fun, if a little grimy. I didn't want to even think about it, but now I have. Oh dear. Anyway, they drove up, they slept in the bus, they saw a bit of the countryside, and about 3.5 days later they got here. Roberto was the only person doing the driving, so he had to take breaks and get a good night's sleep and all of that, obviously for safety purposes. But get here they did, and it was absolutely marvellous. Seeing everybody again, all the family being together, Christmas and all of that, fantastic. And of course, having the minivan meant that they were able to take some big family trips to the beaches around sort of in the general area, and that was also fantastic for everybody. So, a terrific visit. But it did get me thinking, I mean, quite courageous actually. Roberto and his girls. ranging in age from two to, I suppose, 50 and a lot. And they came through it just fine. Roberto is quite remarkable in how cheerful he seems to remain, how he manages stress and all of that. So I guess this road trip, in terms of stress, would have been less stressful than typically driving 10 or 12 school children and all the associated babble morning, noon and night to and from schools. So, perhaps it's not surprising that he took it so well, but it is still a remarkable trip. And it did set me off thinking about a point that I've made before, how I think we all have this potential to do extraordinary things. And I think a 2,000 plus mile road trip through the center of Brazil in a school van is fantastic. It's not an ordinary sort of holiday. And it was a great experience, and one that they will talk about for years to come. Maybe eventually little Aninha will have forgotten about it, seeing as she was 2 and all of that. But she seems like quite an alert 2-year-old, so that memory will be on her mind for quite some time. And I guess they're going to do it again eventually. It certainly sounded like they planned to. And others like it, get to know more of the country. And it sort of ties in with something that I've spoken about before, about leading an extraordinary life. And by extraordinary, I don't mean exceptional results or doing things that are necessarily mind-bogglingly out of the ordinary. No, it's doing ordinary things sometimes in a sort of maximal kind of way. So driving on holiday is not an extraordinary thing to do. But taking a road trip across a continent, well, that's another story. Whether it's driving from New York to LA, or from London to Athens, or, if you're truly foolhardy and very well prepared, Cape Town to Cairo. Why not? That's another magnitude, I think, a factor removed in terms of risk and craziness. But be that as it may, it's an example of doing an ordinary thing in an extraordinary way. And it has to be said that this is, with a little bit of creative thought, something that I think is available to possibly all, certainly almost all of us. We have the chance of doing something, but taking it to a kind of another limit. If we just sat down and thought for a while, this is what I normally do. What would this thing look like if I did it in a way that everybody would go, wow? What would be an extraordinary summer holiday within the means that I have at my disposal? What would be extraordinary parenting, or being an extraordinary professional in what might be a humdrum sort of profession, or a hobby? How could you take your hobby to another level? Now, in this case, the family, in the end, they did this on a relatively low budget, and none of them are, exceptional wealth. That they did something that pretty much any kind of average family couldn't plan and then execute. So it wasn't about having a load of money, and therefore that makes the extraordinary accessible. Not at all. And what I'm talking about definitely is doing things in a way that doesn't require you to have a fortune at your disposal, or an amount of time that is, beyond the reach of most people. And I find it, I have to say, quite inspiring. I mean, sometimes I stop and think about what we're doing here, and it becomes kind of ordinary. And with all these visits, whether it was my friend Elizabeth who'd never been here before, or whether it was a family who hadn't been here for 6 years, some of them, and they said, wow, things have changed. When you're living, it's kind of like having, being a mum or a dad, and your children growing up, and you don't notice it at the time, and then suddenly, boy, they have shot up. Certainly that's true when you see children, nieces or nephews that you haven't seen for years. Well, you notice it immediately. But if you're kind of wrapped up in the middle of it all, you don't. It becomes every day a sort of small increment in terms of a child's growth, millimeters, occasionally shooting up by the odd centimetre or two, but you don't really notice it because it's a continual process. And Rita and I suppose, we run the risk of becoming a little bit blasé about what we're doing, because it too has been something happening gradually in small little leaps and spurts over the last 8 years. And then people come and visit and you think, wow, we actually are doing something that's, I think, quite incredible. And then when I think like that, I'm quite excited. Isn't this wonderful? And I think this is something that far more of us have as a possibility in our lives. It will take time. A journey, 2,000 kilometers, to do it under the circumstances they did it, and to make the horrible, I seem to be contracting a lot of words today. Never mind. To make the holiday viable, of course, it wasn't something they would do over a long weekend. That would have been quite unpleasant. But spreading it out over a few weeks and, it suddenly becomes doable. And I think we have this if we take a long enough time horizon, and that's my point. Whether it's more of a life project where you need to think of it in terms of 5-10 years rather than a few months, or whether it's a long holiday which you spend a year or 2 years saving up for and then really do something extraordinary, whether it's a hobby that you double down on. You say, I'm not just going to dabble in this, dabble at this, I suppose. Is that right? Yes, probably is. I'm not just going to be a dabbler. I'm going to do this seriously and see what happens. Of course, nothing will happen in the short term, but in the long term, something remarkable probably will. And it is very empowering, and that's certainly true for Roberto, Thais, and the family, that I think, having done this once, suddenly it becomes something that they can do again, visiting here again, and visiting other places. And that, I think, is one of the big payoffs of these kind of adventures. That you go from being a little timid and conservative to being an adventurer. I kind of think Bilbo Baggins before and after his grand adventure. Okay, it's fiction and fantasy, but there's a dragon's gold out there for all of us, however much of a homebody Bilbo we might think we are. So that's it for this week. As always, I trust you're well, your lives are filled with joy, and the final episode in our summer holiday visits will be ready for you in a week or so. So until then, ciao from a sunny Brazil.